right. Well, thank you everybody for allowing me to talk to you this evening. Now, some of you might recognize this. Um, this illustration appeared in the Golden Book of the Civil War. It's the Battle of Antietam, and it was also used on the cover of the Battle of Antietam Centennial Program Guide, and that's where I got my copy. Now, the Battle of Antietam stands out as the single bloodiest day's combat in American history. More Americans were killed, wounded, or went missing on September 17th, 1862, than any other day in our nation's entire history. With 23,000 casualties, it is understandable that this single event tends to take the spotlight in the Maryland campaign of 1862. However, Robert E. Lee did not begin crossing the Potomac River on September 4th, 1862, just so he could fight at Sharpsburg 13 days later with his back to that same river. There were many people, places, and events in between. Now, my third book, From Frederick to Sharpsburg, sheds light on some of the other personalities and locations long overlooked in the shadow cast by America's bloodiest single day's combat. And you can see some of the personalities. We have Barbara Fritchie, Stonewall Jackson, Jesse Lee Reno, and Jeb Stuart. This campaign map is taken from a 1962 centennial edition of the Civil War Times Illustrated, and it's one of my favorite maps. And it shows the route that Lee took beginning on September 4th when he crosses the Potomac River at White's Ford near Leesburg, which is located at the bottom of the map in the center. And then he moves about 25 miles north into Frederick. And I also want to point out on this map, located about halfway, is Sugarloaf Mountain. Now, by September 7th, Lee's army occupies Frederick, Maryland, and they encamp on the southern outskirts of the town. This is an 1858 map of Frederick, and at the time, there were about 8,000 inhabitants in the city. Now, some of you might be old enough to recognize this book. This is a 1955 children's book on the Civil War, and it was one of the first books that I read on the Civil War. And it has an illustration that I really like when it comes to the entry of the Confederate Army into Frederick in September 1862. This picture is worth 1,000 words. You can see the reception is decidedly cool. There's not a person on the streets. The windows are shuttered up, and in the traditional histories of the campaign, the reception given to Lee and the Confederate Army is pretty much cold shouldered. Now, what I found out in my research is that Maryland's population, we're roughly grouped into thirds. One third fully supported the Union and Abraham Lincoln. A middle third supported the Union and did not necessarily like Lincoln. And there was another third of the population which sympathized with the South and supported the South and actually supported secession. Now, by war's end, some 20,000 Marylanders would fight for the Confederacy, some 50,000 for the Union, and that sort of reflects that. But I've always liked this illustration, because they are definitely getting the cold shoulder. Now, this also brings up the subject of the popular image of Robert E. Lee, in the traditional histories of the Maryland campaign. Now, we have a monument at Antietam that reflects this popular image. And there's Lee, sitting on his horse, pair of binoculars in his hands. But the monument is far from the reality. The day after the Battle of Second Manassas or Second Bull Run, August 31st, Lee suffers a debilitating accident. He severely sprains both of his wrists and he breaks at least one bone in his right hand. Now, this illustration, popular painting by Don Troiani, shows Lee at Antietam. And as you can see, there's something just not quite right about it. We look at the right hand and it's bandaged and the right arm is in a sling, but still Lee is able, to hold the reins. Now, in truth of fact, it was a little bit different. This is a sketch that I did and is used as an illustration in my book. Now, Lee severely sprained both of his wrists to the point where they had to be immobilized in splints. And he broke at least one bone in his right hand, perhaps more. We don't know. There were no x rays in 1862. The attending physician had to go on discoloration and range of movement, and he could not hold anything. Now, we do have some accounts of him being on horseback the day of the Battle of Antietam, but if he was being led by the reins. And that is according to his son, Robert E. Lee Jr., who was in an artillery battery at Antietam, and his nephew, Fitzhugh Lee, who commanded a cavalry brigade. He spent most of the campaign riding in an ambulance, and he was limited to where four wheels could take him. Now, he could not dress himself without the help of an orderly. He could not feed himself without the help of an orderly. There were other things he couldn't do, and we're just not going to go there. But he may not have been making the best judgments that he otherwise would have made. We don't know if he was taking pain medication. A popular pain medication of the day was laudanum, half alcohol, half opium. But even if he wasn't, he was putting in long hours. He was in chronic pain. He was certainly embarrassed. Now, his premier biographer, Douglas Southall Freeman, writes that at no other time in the war, other than the Maryland campaign, did Lee show such infirmity of judgment. And those are Freeman's words. And Freeman questions Lee's decision to divide his army in Maryland. He even questions the decision to fight at Sharpsburg. And the language that he uses is infirmity of judgment. And I cannot help but think that some of that infirmity of judgment was due to his injuries. So we have the legend on one side and we have the fact on another. And there is an appendix in from Frederick to Sharpsburg, a chapter-length appendix, that explores Lee's injuries and how it may have affected his decision-making. And by the way, both Lee and Jackson entered Frederick in an ambulance. Jackson fell from a horse the day before, and he thought the ambulance a little more comfortable. And they did not enter at the same time either. Now, one other former citizen of Frederick that I want to point out to you. Some of you may recognize this gentleman. This is Bradley T. Johnson. He was a native of Frederick. He was an attorney before the war, and he actually raised the first company of Maryland militia to go south. And he became a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. And during the occupation of Frederick, he was the provost marshal. Now, of course, one of the most famous citizens of Frederick in September 1862 was Barbara Fritchie. And this illustration attempts to show Barbara. Now, the Fritchie house is located on West Patrick Street. Some of you who have visited Frederick probably recognize it. Now, that house is a reproduction. It was built in 1927, uh, totally as a tourist attraction. The original house was demolished in 1869 due to flooding from Carroll Creek. But this is what it would have looked like in 1862. Now, Barbara's husband, John Fritchie, uh, was a leather worker, and he actually had a shop uh, built adjacent to the house, and primarily he made and sold gloves. Now, Barbara Fritchie was a real person. She was born a subject of the British Crown in 1766. When she was 40 years old, she married 26-year-old John. They got married in 1806. Now, John died at the age of 69 in 1849. You could say that Barbara put him in his grave. Now, at the time, she was 83 years old, and she was granted use of the estate for life. Now, Barbara Fritchie passed away at the age of 96 on December 18th, 1862, 3 months after the Confederate occupation of Frederick. And, this is probably when you think of Barbara Fritchie, you think of this photograph, but she was not always the old wrinkled crone of whoops, excuse me, of fame and legend. This is a cameo I found at the Frederick Historical Society, and it shows a silhouette of Barbara Fritchie in her teens, and it appears that she was a quite attractive teenager. So once again, she was a real person, and she was not always 96 years old. Now, Barbara was made famous in a poem that was published in October 1863, more than a year after the Confederate occupation of Frederick. The poem by John Greenleaf Whittier laid the foundation for the legend of Barbara Fritchie. It told of a confrontation between Barbara and General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. And this is a colorful illustration of that part of the poem. Now, some of you may be familiar with the story around the poem. The Confederate Army is marching out of Frederick. Barbara runs up to a second-story dormer window, waves an American flag at the troops as they were marching by. And there's actually a volley of musketry is fired, and the flagstaff is broken. She picks it up and continues waving it and says something to the effect of, "Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag." And Stonewall rides up and admonishes his troops, and he yells at them, "Who touches a hair of yon gray head dies like a dog, march on." Now, in truth of fact, a Quaker poet who likely never saw the city, a 96-year-old lady, and a Confederate general who likely never saw either poet or lady made as fine an advertising project as any city could desire. Now, I'm old enough to remember the Barbara Fritchie restaurant on the Golden Mile outside of Frederick. Route 40 west out of Frederick locally is known as the Golden Mile. And there, the Fritchie House was advertised in the city. So it was a very good advertising project for Frederick. Now, there is a curious aspect to Barbara Fritchie. She owned enslaved people. Barbara and John had a manservant named Harry and a woman servant, Nellie. And there is a curious document recorded in the Frederick County Courthouse. It is a bill of sale for an infant slave, and it's dated January 9th, 1858. And it reads in part, I, Barbara Fritchie of Frederick County, in consideration of $10 paid me by Eliza Davis, resident of Frederick, do hereby bargain and sell to said Eliza Davis my Negro slave, George Davis. And at the time of the sale, George was 2 years old. And in that document, she retains right to George's labor for 20 years, which begs the question, how long did she think she was going to live? Now, the document was signed by Barbara Fritchie. Eliza Davis made her mark. Apparently, she was illiterate. And the attorney representing Eliza was Bradley T. Johnson, Esquire. Now, after the war, Bradley Johnson became one of the most well-known critics of the poem, what he called the Whittier incident, that it never happened, and he said he knew Barbara Fritchie. And of course, because he was a Confederate, many in the North said, well, naturally you're going to dismiss this poem. Okay, you're a Confederate soldier. However, when Bradley Johnson said that he knew Barbara Fritchie, he knew Barbara Fritchie. Now, there was a lady that lived a little bit further west on Patrick Street, and her name was Mary Quantrell, and she did wave a flag at a Confederate officer. And in front of her house, there is a historic marker with this painting on it that shows Mary and shows some Confederate officer. All right, we don't know for sure who it was that she waved the flag at. There was a lot of flag waving going on in Frederick during the Confederate occupation, but there seems to have been a blending of stories. Whittier, the poet, he actually got a fourth-hand story, and he went with it. And I have a whole chapter in the book on the legend of Barbara Fritchie. Now, another subject in the book is Sugarloaf Mountain. And I have a chapter called The Overlooked Confederate Intelligence Failure. And the pun is intended. And this is how Sugarloaf looks from Frederick, looking across the Bess Farm, which is south of Frederick, where the Confederates camped when they occupied Frederick. Some of you might recognize this. This is Dahlgren Chapel on South Mountain. And you may be wondering, well, if he's talking about Sugarloaf, why are we looking at something located on South Mountain? Well, if you've ever been to Turner's Gap, the Appalachian Trail runs through Turner's Gap, and it runs right up behind Dahlgren Chapel. And on a clear day, if you walk up behind the chapel, you can look across Frederick County and you can see Sugarloaf Mountain there in the center. And as the crow flies, that's a distance of about 18 miles. Sugarloaf is located on the border between Frederick County and Montgomery County. Now, why is this important? Well, if we go to the Battle of South Mountain, actually the evening before, on September 13th, from this very spot, Brigadier General Alfred Colquitt of Daniel Harvey Hill's division observes clouds of dust being raised by elements of Jesse Lee Reno's Ninth Corps marching out of Frederick. And from Turner's Gap, Frederick is about 11 miles to the east. So Colquitt is able to see dust clouds 11 miles away on September 13th. Now, Sugarloaf Mountain absolutely dominates the landscape of southeastern Frederick County. At an elevation of 1,282 feet above sea level, the mountain rises some 800 feet above the surrounding countryside. And on a clear day, looking eastward from the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, Washington, D.C. is visible. Now, there was a Union signal station on top of Sugarloaf Mountain in September 1862. And when Lee begins crossing the river on September 4th, a Lieutenant Brinkerhoff Minor, a Union signalman, actually sends a communication to Washington. Now it's picked up a couple miles away and then telegraphed, but this is part of his communication. Continuous clouds of dust seen on roads leading in and out of Leesburg. So from the top of Sugarloaf, Minor was able to see clouds of dust at Leesburg, and that's about 13 miles from Sugarloaf Mountain. Now, I'm sure everybody recognizes this personality. This is Major General James Ewell Brown Jeb Stuart. From September 6th through September 11th, Sugarloaf Signal Station was occupied by Stuart's signalmen. All right, spoiler alert. The events of September 6th through the 11th do not portray Jeb Stuart in a favorable light. This is Special Orders number 191. It was issued on September 9th, 1862, and it divided Lee's army for the Harper's Ferry operation. And this is a typescript copy as it appears in the official records. Back to the Civil War Times campaign map. Now, Union movements are shown in blue. Confederate movements are shown in magenta. In the days prior to Special Orders 191 being issued, Lee is informed by Stuart that the Union Army is in Rockville and moving slowly. Now, Rockville is located in the lower right corner of this map, just a little bit north of Washington. Now, the thing to understand about Lee in Maryland, he thinks he has weeks, not days, to conduct the Harper's Ferry operation. He thinks he has weeks, not days. Now, part of the reason is the information he's getting from Stuart. Part of the reason he's counting on the Union Army being so demoralized after Second Manassas, it's going to take them some time to get their act together. But weeks, not days. Orders 191 are also known as the Lost Orders because General George B. McClellan is presented with a copy 4 days after it was issued. He gets a copy on September 13th. Now, time does not permit a full explanation of all the fallacies surrounding this document. But if you will permit me a moment of shameless self-promotion, I will simply say that it is not the intelligence landfall that popular history makes it out to be. And the entire first chapter of my second book, Too Useful to Sacrifice, covers all the fallacies of this misunderstood document. For now, I'm just going to show you this. Now, as written by Lee on the left of the screen, the orders have 10 articles. The copy that McClellan gets, if you look at the top, it begins with Article 3. The first two articles are missing. Now, McClellan wasn't clairvoyant. He didn't know what was in those two articles. So, in actuality, what McClellan gets is a partial copy of a 4-day-old marching order that was actually contradicted by actual field intelligence. Now, you may recognize this individual. This is Major Heroes von Bork, and he was Stuart's chief of staff. Now, one might wonder, what were his duties on September 8th? You know, the day before 191 is issued. One would think those duties might include collecting intelligence on enemy movements. I mean, if Lee's going to divide his army, maybe we ought to make sure that McClellan is where we think he is. All right. So was it collecting intelligence on enemy movements? No. His duties on September 8th were collecting regimental flags to decorate an abandoned female academy in Urbana. And that night, September 8th into the morning of September 9th, is the famous Sabers and Roses Ball. Now, von Bork did actually write, the dancing was kept up to the first glimmer of dawn. One wonders how many of Stuart's command were incapacitated the following day, September 9th, the day 191 is issued to the Army. We know Stuart didn't get up until noon. His staff and certainly some of his troopers spent the good part of September 9th sleeping and recovering from the festivities of the night before. Now, why is this important? All right, back to the campaign map. You will see Sugarloaf Mountain in the center, and you will see two circles around Sugarloaf Mountain. The inner circle has a radius of 11 miles, the distance from Turner's Gap to Frederick, the distance that Colquitt saw the clouds of dust being raised. The outer circle is 18 miles, the distance from Turner's Gap to Sugarloaf. So we have 11 miles and 18 miles. And I want you to look in the lower right corner, and the Union Army is at Rockville on September 6th, and that's right on the 18-mile line. And Civil War armies raised dust clouds. That's a historical fact. Now look at September 9th, the day 191 is issued. All right. Franklin's left army wing is in Poolesville. All right. And they're closer than that 11 miles. Sumner's center wing is at Middlebrook on the 11-mile circle. And even Burnside's right army wing at Brookville is just on the periphery of the 18 miles. Then look at September 10th, the day the Confederate Army's marching out of Frederick. Franklin's at Bealsville, Sumner's at Clarksburg, elements of the Ninth Corps at Damascus. Now, these armies were raising clouds of dust, and there were Confederate signalmen on Sugarloaf. This represents, in my opinion, some kind of intelligence failure on the part of Jeb Stuart. And the chapter in the book explores this situation. Now, had Lee been aware of the true nature of McClellan's movements, that he had only days and not weeks, he might have rethought the wisdom of dividing his army. Now, we're moving to Fox's Gap, and those of you who have been to Fox's Gap will recognize this immediately. This is the Reno Monument, and people who are not familiar with Civil War history and go hiking in the mountains, they become aware that something related to the Civil War happened at Fox's Gap because of this monument. This is probably the most famous picture of Fox's Gap. If you are reading a book on the Maryland campaign and you get to the Battle of South Mountain, chances are you'll see this illustration or this photograph. We don't know exactly when taken. We know it was sometime before 1889 because the Reno Monument is not visible. The cabin is known as Wise's Cabin, and it was occupied at the time by an old farmer named Daniel Wise. And I have a chapter in the book on the legend of Wise's Well. Now, when I got interested in South Mountain and Fox's Gap back in the 1980s, I attempted to do an actual cut and paste to try and pin down the location of the cabin. And this is an illustration I came up with. And if you look at the far left of the picture, you can see the Reno Monument. And that's why I say this photograph was before the Reno Monument. So here's the cut and paste. And if you go looking for this site today, this is what you're going to see. The cabin site is now a small parking area. And when I took this photograph, the Reno Monument was not visible through the trees. Now, this is a 19th century illustration of Confederate dead at Fox's Gap. And there was a legend that grew out of the burial of some of the dead at Fox's Gap. On the day after the combat, which would be September 15th, some Ohio troops assigned a task they did not particularly like sought a shortcut by dumping some of the bodies down a well in front of a cabin. The old man who lived on the property, Farmer Daniel Wise, realizing that his well was ruined and being a shrewd old codger, made the most of a bad situation by contracting with General Ambrose E. Burnside to continue the process for $1 a body. He threw 58 bodies or more in the well, sealed the well, and earned himself a tidy sum. And so goes the legend. Now, this photo actually came from the Middletown Valley Register from 1919 when the cabin was demolished. And supposedly, if you look at the far right of the picture, X marks the spot. The well was located just on the other side of the fence. Now, once again, if you'll allow me another moment of shameless self-promotion, my first book, The Bivouacs of the Dead, covered the legend of the well and the actual truth of what happened. They weren't put in the well by a crazy old farmer. They were put in the well by a Union burial detail, a drunk Union burial detail. Now, this is a Alexander Gardner photo of a burial detail at Antietam, and it's pretty typical of what you would have found up at Fox's Gap. Now, I don't blame them for being drunk. It was not pleasant duty. I don't want to offend anybody's aesthetic sensibilities, but they were put in that well on September 16th, 2 days after the battle, exposed to warm September sunshine in farm country. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, in 2003, the site of the Wise Cabin was purchased by the National Park Service for incorporation into the Appalachian Trail. And during the summer, a collaboration of archaeologists, historians, and trail volunteers were able to explore the site and accomplish some meaningful archaeology for the first time since the Battle of South Mountain. And I was very fortunate to be a part of that archaeology study that summer. And by the end of the summer, we found a hand-dug stone-lined 19th century structure that we assume was the water well. Now, it may have been a cistern, which is similar to a well, but we found the historical well. And the chapter in From Frederick to Sharpsburg dealing with the legend of Wise's well also deals with what we found when we did the archaeology. Now, I also have a chapter devoted to General Jesse Lee Reno, and it's entitled Whose Bullet? All right. We still don't know who shot Reno or where he was shot. Now, General Jesse Lee Reno was a promising 39-year-old Union career officer. He was the youngest of McClellan's corps commanders, and he perished before his time on the slopes of South Mountain. Now, at Fox's Gap, as dusk fell on the evening of September 14th, it appeared that Reno thought a final push north could carry the whole ridge as far as Turner's Gap, 1 mile to the north. For the moment, it seemed as if his troops were stalled, and he was determined to find out why firsthand. Now, when you visit Fox's Gap, if you attempt to explore it and investigate it and find out, what happened in the Civil War, it can be difficult. This is what Fox's Gap looks like today. Letter A represents the site of the Reno Monument. There's a very small open area around the monument. B is the parking lot. The Appalachian Trail, the dashed line, runs through the site. Everything is forested except for a small field north of the Reno Monument, and that is fastly allowing to grow into forest. So this is what it looks like now, and this is what it looked like in September 1862, and it's a whole lot different. It was much more open ground. The cabin was surrounded by an acre of garden enclosed on three sides by stone walls. There was a 3 acre field to the east. The field to the north was much larger, and there was a small opening north of the cabin. So this is what the Civil War appearance looks like. Now, Reno, he rode northerly along the crest of the mountain, and as the general reached the vicinity of Wise's cabin, shots rang out. They struck Reno, and within an hour he was dead. Almost from the time of his death, there has been speculation and controversy as to whose bullet, enemy or friendly, brought an end to the promising military career of Jesse Lee Reno. And this is one of my maps showing troop positions at the end of the day and the route of Reno's last ride. Now, as I said before, we don't know exactly who shot him. I mean, there's one of two choices. He was shot by a Confederate soldier, or, he was shot by a Union soldier. There was a friendly fire incident. The 35th Massachusetts and the 9th New Hampshire were new regiments, less than 3 weeks in the service. And at the last attack of the day, they panicked, fired their rifles into the backs of the 51st Pennsylvania. So there was a friendly fire incident. And if you're an infantryman, you got your own peculiar kind of tunnel vision. If you turn around, there's a dead general. Oh, okay, he died here. Now, there's also controversy as to where he was shot. Many of the veterans felt that he was shot in the field east of the cabin, and just as many felt that he was shot in the field north of the cabin. Now, this is the Reno Monument dedication on September 14th, 1889, and it gives you an idea of how open the site was. About 1,200 people in attendance, and you can see the top of the monument poking up above the people. And if you go looking for this today, same perspective, this is what you're going to see. Although most histories of the Maryland campaign treat Reno's death as an isolated event, his absence at Antietam 3 days later may have cost General McClellan the complete, total, decisive victory he so earnestly sought to achieve. Right? Reno was young and energetic, and there is controversy down at the lower bridge on September 17th. And had Reno been alive, Lee might have had a different battle on his hands, and that is explored in the book. We might have known that bridge as Reno's Bridge. And that brings up, the subject of General Burnside. There is a chapter in the book called The Enigma of Burnside and Cox. High command dysfunction. Controversy swirls around General Burnside, and the events in the 2 days between the battles of South Mountain and Antietam, September 15th and September 16th. Now, from the outset, any discussion of these events must contend with one of the most perplexing controversies of the campaign, and it revolves around the temporary suspension of Burnside's right Army wing, the suspension of the wing structure. And, this is the kind of stuff that can make your hair hurt sometimes. Now, prior to the Battle of South Mountain, Burnside commanded an Army wing. He commanded the 1st Corps and the 9th Corps. And the 1st Corps was commanded by General Joseph Fightin' Joe Hooker. And as we know, the 9th Corps was commanded by Reno. Now, on the morning of September 15th, General McClellan suspended the formal wing structure and assumed direct command over Hooker's 1st Corps. It was an operational decision on McClellan's part. There was nothing personal about it. As commanding general of the Army, it was McClellan's prerogative. It actually represented his attempt to deal with contingency and take advantage of his available logistics to enable as rapid a pursuit of the enemy as possible. And yes, I did use rapid and McClellan in the same sentence. Furthermore, the suspension was always meant to be a temporary condition. Now, this map shows the 3 gaps where the Battle of South Mountain occurred. Now, Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap are separated by about a mile. And Hooker's 1st Corps is at Turner's Gap, Reno's 9th Corps at Fox's Gap. Now, Burnside was responsible for the tactical dispositions at the Battle of South Mountain. And South Mountain was a success. It was a victory for Union arms. Right? Burnside was not a bad general. Right? But on the morning of the 15th, his 2 Army Corps are separated by a mile. And so McClellan gives Hooker independent command and charges him with the pursuit to Antietam. There is evidence that Burnside perceived the reorganization as a sudden and senseless demotion. Therefore, after the death of Reno, rather than assume direct tactical command, as McClellan expected, as the men expected, Burnside relied on the next officer in the chain of command, Brigadier General Jacob D. Cox. And he treated Cox as a corps commander in a wing that no longer existed. Now, to say the least, this created a dysfunctional situation where there was confusion by some in the 9th Corps as to who, Burnside or Cox, exercised command after South Mountain. This is Colonel Hugh Ewing. He commands a brigade of 3 Ohio regiments at the Lower Bridge on September 17th. Now, the day before, on the 16th, Ewing actually wrote this. On the 16th, found the enemy in position along the Antietam. My brigade went into position on our extreme left in support of Benjamin's battery and other guns. In assuming place, I received conflicting orders from General Cox commanding the Corps and General Burnside. The latter I obeyed. Now, I don't know about you, but when a brigade commander has to choose which commanding general he's going to obey, I call that dysfunction. And my chapter deals with the situation with Burnside and Cox and conditions on the 15th and the 16th. Now, battle is a word that is often misused for any type of combat. And understand that, I have several appendices on forgotten battles, for lack of a better word. The Battle of Sugarloaf Mountain, September 10th and 11th. There's the Battle of Frederick on September 12th with Union cavalry coming in from the east and Confederate cavalry coming in from the west, right by Barbara Fritchie's house. They clash right in the middle of town. Saddles are emptied. There's the Battle of Hagen's Gap on September 13th, where the National Turnpike crosses over the Catoctin Mountains. And after Hagen's Gap is cleared, Stuart will make two stands on Middletown and one west of town. And related to the stands that Stuart makes the cavalry actions at Middletown is the Battle of Quebec Schoolhouse. And you could end up just as dead at Quebec Schoolhouse as you could at Dunkard Church. And you can see this is a early 20th century quad sheet. The roads are fairly representative of Civil War roads, and Union cavalry proceeding southwest from Middletown. You can see Quebec Schoolhouse, and there's an insert showing where public school is located. Now, if you go looking for a Quebec Schoolhouse today, this is what you're going to see. And the book ends with a appendice on the mysterious color bearer of Fox's Gap. Now, if you've been to Fox's Gap and you've been back to the North Carolina Monument, then you're familiar with this. On the other side of the monument, there's a passage from Robert B. Wilson, 12th Ohio, correspondence to General Ezra A. Carman, and that name may be familiar to some of you. He was on the Antietam Battlefield Board. And this passage, describes a color bearer who jumped up on the rear of the garden wall around the cabin. All right. Now, spoiler alert, this passage has absolutely nothing to do with a North Carolina color bearer. And to find out what the passage is about, you're just going to have to read a copy of From Frederick to Sharpsburg. And that concludes my presentation.